Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Vox Vomitus, also known as Word Vomit. I am your host, Jennifer Ann Gordon, the author of the award-winning novel Beautiful, Frightening, and Silent, as well as the Hotel series and the upcoming novel Pretty Ugly. I am joined by authoress Allison Martine, my co-host and author of the Bourbon books. And we have a very special guest with us today. We have Madeline Martin, author of the book everybody is currently talking about, Last Bookshop in London. Yay! So welcome, Madeline. Tell our audience a little bit about yourself and about your new book, The Last Bookshop of London.
Okay, well, so since this book has come out, I can now say that I am a New York Times bestselling and international bestselling author. So, yay!
Congratulations!
Congratulations!
Definitely is very, very exciting. The Last Bookshop in London is a historical fiction set during World War II, during the Blitz. And even though it does have the backdrop of the war, it really is sort of like an homage to reading. And it's really the whole point of it is like a celebration of reading. So if you like classic books and you like references to those, you will love this. Even if you don't, hopefully you still love it. I had so much fun doing all of the research for World War II. I'm a total research junkie. So this was so much fun, just delving completely into it and writing and going into all these details and everything. So I hope that I brought it to life. I did have one reviewer who on NetGalley had said that she actually wondered if I had lived through the Blitz because of how I wrote it, which was very, very flattering. So
time travel. I'm hearing that there's some kind of time travel going on, or really good anti-aging regimen for your skin.
Yes.
I'm actually a vampire.
Oh,
no one said anything.
Well, congratulations again on being a New York Times bestseller. That is incredibly exciting. Back when we booked you, you were just a USA Today bestselling author, and now look at you. So, Madeline, this is not your first book. You are very much known for your historical romances.
Right.
Now, what made you decide to make the leap to just historical fiction with a touch of romance, just a sprinkle?
Jinx. So I've actually always just loved history. And so I really did feel like sort of the natural progression in my career has gone from doing historical romance, where I did get to mention the history, but I didn't get to really throw myself into it, to going on to historical fiction, where I really do get to offer a little bit more of those details. Because, with romance, your highlight is definitely going to be more the sexual tension and the two souls that are broken sort of becoming one together. Whereas the historical fiction, you obviously do still have like the arc of the character and everything, but the backdrop is basically a character itself. And so you really get to go just buck wild, giving all these nitty gritty details that usually you would kind of have to gloss over.
So how long do you normally research a book before you dive in, or do you research as you're writing, or?
I like to front load my research. And when it comes to my historical romances, so when I tell you guys that I am a history dork, like I am a full on history dork, my romances go from medieval to 16th century, all the way to Regency era. And I do extensive research on all of those as I write them. And so a lot of those I actually already have a lot of the knowledge on, but this particular book, I made sure to do a bunch of the research ahead of time. And I did probably about 6 months of research before I really started writing it. And then as I was writing it, I was continuing to do research. Really, I did research all the way through copy edits. And then I made myself stop because I knew they'd probably kill me if I was like, oh, but wait.
I have one more detail I can cram into one of these chapters. Hold on.
Yeah, exactly. So I was like, okay, Madeline, you need to like dial it back so that they don't like kill you. So yeah, but there are still things I look up. Like, oh man, I could have added that in. So
were any of your historical romances ever set in this era, or was this the first time you were writing about the World War II era?
So this is the first time that I've actually written about the World War II era. And the research was definitely interesting because I haven't had access to YouTube videos, YouTube sound bites, actual photos. I did so much of my research, and I had my magnifying glass sitting next to my computer because I like zoom in and like, oh, what is this? And I could actually read the names of locations. And, if you look at a picture of the street, you can actually see what stores and everything are there. Yeah. Obviously, you don't have that with Regency and with medieval.
I was going to say, not a lot of photographs of the medieval area.
Exactly. Well, and even like when I was writing the bombing scenes in my book, I actually went to YouTube and I listened to, they did recordings of air raids. And so you hear the air raid siren going off, you hear this ominous silence, and then you hear the distant battle coming in. And then you hear where it's so loud and on top of them that like it's so cacophonous, it's almost like white noise. And then it starts to ebb away and then silence, and then you have the all clear. And so I would listen to that while I was writing these. And you can't really do that as much with the other genres that I've written.
No.
Yeah. But I've always read historical World War II fiction. So, yeah.
So was it always like your dream to write a book about World War II? If you read about it a lot, was it deep?
Actually, yeah, I have really, I really wanted to start writing in this genre for a while, especially I grew up in Germany. And so I really was around so much of just the lessons that were learned and everything from what happened. And I think you really can't help but be affected by it when you are so close to, the horror and everything that happened there. And while my book isn't per se about the Holocaust, obviously, Hitler still had, horrible things that he did over there as well. So it is something that I've wanted to write for a long time. And I'm so grateful that I've had the opportunity to really break into this genre. And obviously, I'm just elated that it's done so well. So
I was going to say, it must be a little bit of a whirlwind of, you're writing in kind of your dream genre about a time period that you've always wanted to write about. And the book is just exploding.
Yes. It's exciting and terrifying because now with, now I have the second book that I'm working on and I'm like, oh my God, what if I suck? So I'm so worried that I'm not going to write a good one for the next one. You know how it is.
There's always that pressure to follow up. Whenever something's well received, you want to make sure that you kind of continue on that and don't just drop the ball. But
right. But you can't really write like The Last Bookshop in London 2. That doesn't work.
My fiance keeps telling me, you have to write The Last Bookshop in Berlin. And I'm like, stop it. And he's like, no, really? I'm like, no.
It's your theme now. Like, no, that wasn't
You'll
what I was going for.
Only be writing about bookshops from now on.
So the next one is not about a bookshop.
Well, one of the questions I was telling Jen before the show, I had taken some notes so that when I was reading it, I remember later, because especially we were all talking beforehand. We've all gotten our COVID shots recently. So if our brains are a little bit Swiss cheese, that is why. And that's part of the reason I took my notes to make sure I'd remember anything I wanted to say. But one of the things you brought up that I thought was really interesting was the concept of a book that came out at just the wrong time. So there's a book that Grace mentions that I think it's called Pigeon Pie.
Pigeon Pie by Nancy Martin.
And this book that just came out and it was just the worst timing. And I'm just thinking about books that came out just before the COVID virus hit that maybe were about pandemics. And some of those did really well anyway, because people are like, well, I'm in one. I might as well read about it. But tell us about Pigeon Pie and why that book was not received during that time as well as maybe the author would have wanted it to. Was this a real book?
Yes, it was actually a real book. In fact, Nancy Mitford is a very popular author who was around during that genre. They were part of a very wealthy family. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and do a little plug for my BFF. Eliza Knight is actually writing a book about Nancy Mitford right now that's set to come out, I believe, April of next year. So actually, that's one of the reasons why I incorporated that book, because she and I really, we interacted so much while we were both writing our stories. And so she was talking about Pigeon Pie coming out around the time that my book was set. So I did some digging and I found that it was a total bomb. And so I thought, oh, well, wouldn't it be perfect if my bookstore girl orders this whole thing of it and it bombs. And it kind of is like the sort of devastating thing for her because she's involved in it. But as far as Pigeon Pie goes, it was written it was supposed to be humorous. And the whole thing is, obviously war is not especially humorous, especially when you are ensconced in it. And her humor was very tongue in cheek and everything. So when it happened to come out, it was right when, now, of course, I don't have all my notes in front of me, but I believe that it was actually right when Hitler started to attack and really start taking everything over. And I think that was when he attacked France, if I remember correctly, but I could be wrong because I'm going to blame this one on COVID.
Yeah. Blame it on Moderna. Moderna number 2.
But I believe it was when France attacked. And so it was kind of like this, like, oh, this is going to be so funny. And then it was like, oh my God, France just fell. This isn't funny anymore.
Not funny anymore.
Pin drop in the room and you're like, okay. So that's kind of why it didn't really do very well, because the timing really just could not have been worse. So, yeah.
Well, I think you did a really good job of capturing the early part of World War II in England, when it was the quote unquote the Boer War, when it was there's a war, but is it really happening? It's not affecting us. We don't see it. We don't hear about it.
Right.
And I think
I
think just like in history in general, for non-history dorks, like normal dorks, but like not history dorks, like other kinds of dorks. I never think about those early years of the war and how kind of slowly the dread did creep over Europe. Like because you only hear the highlights and the lowlights. You just think World War II, and immediately London's being bombed. So I think you did. I liked hearing about the fact that the girls still wanted to go dancing and they wanted to go to cafes, and they were just like, oh, it's so hard to come home from the movie theater because it's dark.
Yeah. And I mean, that really was a very big thing. I mean, and in fact, it was so crazy to me that these young people were still meeting up and doing dancing, excuse me, even with all the bombings going on. Sorry. So like, they could be in the middle of a dance hall and even walking home from it that night, and bombs could be going off. And they're like, oh, well, at least I got to go and have fun. And that really was kind of the mentality for the young people. A lot of them were sort of that, like, live in the moment, because you don't know when it could be your last. And, going to the Boer War, another thing that was really fascinating about it was that they were so bored that they actually were kind of eager for action to happen. And it sounds weird to wish for something to happen that's so horrible, but they really just were so tired of this constant, I guess it's like, when they say that the anticipation is worse than the actual act, I think it may have been sort of along those lines. But I think there was also sort of like this thrilling, I'm alive sort of sensation that you get from being in that life or death sort of moment for so long. Because a lot of people, I read through a lot of diaries, which is where I got a lot of the mood and everything that I used in the book. And a lot of people after the war was over, they actually missed that excitement. It was like their lives were almost kind of empty without it, if that makes sense.
I've heard this a lot because I've read some journals and stuff from World War II era, especially from the women who finally got a chance to be ambulance drivers, who got to be, in the thick of it. And then immediately after, they're just shipped right back into their homes. And it's like, now you're going to be a mommy. And
and
that is your job.
Thanks for your service. We're done with you. And I tried to kind of address that a little bit at the very end too, because I really felt like I kind of, with a lot of these characters, I actually got my ideas based off of reading through a lot of these journals. They had something called mass observation, where they paid people to record their thoughts before, during, and after the war. And there were hundreds of people who did this. And it makes for a lot of reading, but it really makes for fascinating reading. And I actually can tell you every single day that the weather was completely on point, because there is nothing people like to discuss more in their diaries for some bizarre reason than the weather. So literally every single day that's been plotted out in my book, the weather is spot on.
But the weather mattered though, because on a clear night, the bombers delight. And on the times where, hey, it's cloudy, well, that means we might survive the night because they can't see where to hit us.
Yeah, so absolutely.
I can see why they'd record it, but I mean, that's good that no one's going to go, you know what, though, Madeline, we checked your book out on this day. It was actually cloudy, so I'm going to have you fix this part.
Well, and even before the bombings really happened, it's so funny how many people really started their journal entries with, it was a lovely day today. It rained a little bit in the afternoon, but after that, it was quite nice, and we went and had tea. And, all this kind of, and it's just funny how much it really does get incorporated in there. But yeah, so I tried to get a lot of my characters. One main one that comes to mind was Colin. Colin's character, I actually was reading through one of the mass observations, and this woman was watching her son, and he had just gotten called to war. And she was just looking at him, and she was just thinking, like, he's not meant for war. He's a gentle soul. Like, and I hated so much for this woman whose son was not meant for this horrible, ugly thing that he was getting ready to be thrust into. And I really felt like he needed to be represented. And so that's where Colin's character came from.
I did love Colin with the tabby cat and the working at Harrods.
Thank you. He was such a, oh gosh, I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to ruin anything. But
Spoilers.
Yeah, no spoilers. But Colin was really just, he was really close to my heart. So
well, and that was one of the things Jen and I were talking about a little bit beforehand, was whether all of the characters were based on real people or if some of them were kind of a hodgepodge of different people that you kind of made one person. Like Grace, your main character, there is no real Grace.
No, there is no real Grace. All of these characters are actually totally made up. But like I said, I definitely was inspired by some of these characters just based off of people that I read when I was reading through the mass observations.
Yeah, because sometimes in a historical fiction, I mean, I've read various kinds of historical fiction. On one hand, you have real era fake people, and in others, you have things like The Other Boleyn Girl, where it's real era, real people, and then we're fictionalizing their ideas and conversations no one actually wrote down to try to fill in the gaps for you. So I looked up certain details going, tell me more about this Paternoster Row.
Which one?
Yeah. Exactly, but Primrose Hill Books.
Yeah, that was fake. That was a fake. That was a fake store. And
tell me I can't go visit in London now.
Unfortunately, no. But you should still go and try. Once the world opens,
that's fine.
But with the thing with the Paternoster Row that was so devastating about it is that over 5 million books were burned in that bombing with all the incendiaries and everything that were happening. And the problem is, too, they had a paper shortage going on. Paper was actually being rationed. So the fact that all of those books were lost to the publishing industry and they couldn't just automatically be generated immediately, it was really very devastating. And so when they ended up making new warehouses, they actually did it on the outskirts of London in the hopes of avoiding anything like that. But it still never had, like with a lot of the warehouses there, they could get their books that afternoon. You order them and they're right there. That was gone. You didn't have that availability or the amount of books available anymore.
Well, and that brings up the idea of rations, where you talked about how the paper was rationed. I remember you talked about Grace having little newspaper birds. So I guess the newspaper was already used, so you could use it for that. I don't remember you saying that the paper was rationed. You were usually hearing about the food being rationed.
Right.
And I cracked up when you had the woman who was like, I have to buy all this stuff so the hoarders don't get it. I'm just laughing so hard because first off, I'm going, we've lived through that recently. Was this inspired by your own true events of Madeline going to the store and going, someone got all the toilet paper, so I better buy all the toilet paper before the hoarders get it.
Exactly. And full disclosure, I wrote this during the pandemic. And it's incredible. I'm actually glad that I wrote it during the pandemic and not before, because even though admittedly, bombing and pandemics are two hugely different natural or disasters, rather not natural, but they're still disasters, and your community is still reeling from it. And you're going to have certain people who come out of the woodwork one way or the other, and certain behavioral actions that people perform based off of what's happening with that. And, hoarding happened to be one of those things. And I actually heard people that were kind of like, oh, get that before it's gone. Oh, we have toilet paper at home. It doesn't matter. Just get it. It's going to be gone. Right. And that's kind of where the idea for, Mrs. Weatherford hoarding all of the stuff before anybody else can get to it, sort of came from. And even things like the wish that the world would just be normal again, how you can't just wish the world into normalcy. Because I can't tell you how many times, I myself had that thought, like, I wish that I could just fly somewhere, but I can't because everything's locked down, And so it really did, even with the masks, they had to have their gas masks with them everywhere they go, or that they went to. So they couldn't even, for example, go to the movies at one point. Yep.
And they were this cute, though. Mine have Mandalorian.
I love it.
This is not a gas mask. This is it's just cuter. So no one should complain about these, because they're way cuter than gas.
Yes, and way more comfortable.
Right. Now, I also loved the fact that, and I think this is another comparison between the pandemic and World War II, is that you really feel like as a world, as a society, we're going through something together. So it really can bring people, in the best of situations, together, as opposed to apart, people
Yeah,
who
absolutely.
might not be friends. And I thought you have quite an array of characters in your book and an array of personalities
Thank
in your book. And Grace she's kind of the Anne of Green Gables, and this
you.
Anne of Green Gables is my favorite character ever, but she kind of is like people gravitate towards her open personality.
Yeah, thank you. And, I tried really hard also to give all of the characters an arc in the book because everybody kind of started off in this story not in a war and ended this story really where they've lived through this war, and nobody is unchanged from that. And I really wanted to try to represent that in all of their characters. So each character really sort of had their own path that they took. So,
well, and you mentioned how this was like a love letter to books. So we joke about, okay, so they said the first part of the war was the Boer War. The pandemic very much so is, hey, we're all bored here, stuck at home, but we have Netflix and Hulu and Tiger King and all these things.
right.
We didn't have that. So you have Grace stepping in and reading and doing this and finding her own love of books and sharing.
Right.
So I just thought that was interesting because they didn't have those same kind of choices that we do. So we're all mad we're stuck at home, but we have all these, just every option, and they aren't making us turn out our lights either.
No, yeah, I can't imagine how. Well, I mean, I guess I can't actually imagine how awful it was though to have all those lights go dark, just because. Yeah, they had a lot of people who died in car accidents. In fact, during the Boer War, really, it was car accidents, dock workers falling into the water. I mean, these were a lot of deaths that were happening because of trying to avoid being bombed. So it really is interesting when you think about, like, I think it was literally like thousands of deaths. Like people were dying because of the blackouts. So yeah, it was really scary.
How did you go about picking which books you were featuring?
So I had a long talk with my dad, first of all. Well, not even really first of all. I kind of had some ideas of ones that I wanted to do, some of your classics like Pride and Prejudice and Emma and, those kind of things, and Forever Amber. And then when I was talking on the phone with my dad, he gave me some more that he liked and that he had really bonded with. And actually, The Count of Monte Cristo, that was actually his idea. He was like, oh, you have to include The Count of Monte Cristo. That was my favorite book when I was, like young and blah, blah. It's such a good book. And so I was thinking about it, and I did want George to introduce the initial book that Grace reads, because I did want him to go to war, and I wanted that to sort of be the guilt trip, the catalyst that made her open the book in the first place,
She has to read.
Yeah, guilt is such a powerful motivator, This guy's gone to war, and so I thought, actually, The Count of Monte Cristo would be wonderful because, it's a guy's book, kind of. I mean, it's an everyone book, but ultimately, like, you're not going to have this guy be like, Emma is legit where it's at.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Like, the book that's going to change your life is Sense and Sensibility.
Exactly. Yes, it's not going to happen. He's like Pride and Prejudice. I mean.
So, I loved the fact that, because I think we can all relate to, as book lovers, falling in love with somebody who gave us a book, and falling in love with somebody because they gave us the right book. And I say falling in love because that can mean anything. But there's just something so magical about getting the right book from the right person.
Yes. Yeah. And that was a lot of fun. And I loved that they connected with books. And so, kind of making it a theme throughout the book or the story together with them, giving each other books and talking about them and everything. It just sort of allowed that love of one another and also the books to grow together, which that's like the perfect kind of tree, right?
Now, I know Allison and I were talking, I think it was earlier today or yesterday, about the love story of George and Grace. And I know most of your other work has been historical romance.
Right.
Was it difficult to keep George and Grace from becoming the central story? Like, did you have to try hard not to share the letters that they wrote back and forth to each other?
No, actually not at all. Because the thing is, I wanted this to be distinctly historical fiction. And because I know that I have the historical romance background, I knew that some people would come in with a jaded perspective and be like, oh, she's just writing romance. It's not the same. She's trying to call it historical fiction, but it's not, So I actually did the opposite. I tried really hard to pull back and keep him as much out of the story. And so when I went through and I did my final, I always do, like, after I write it all, I always do one final read through. And I feel like that's like kind of where the Madeline magic kind of happens, hopefully, in the book. And that's where I kind of started to actually thread in a little bit more of him, because I realized that I'd made it a bit too anemic on that side. And when my edits came back, they actually did ask for some little snippets from the letters, but everywhere where I tried to fit it in, it just felt really awkward, and it didn't feel like it flowed well with what was happening at that particular time. It felt like pausing to write a little snippet would almost drag the pacing a little bit.
And I know there was a letter that you have, but it's not from him. It's a letter later that's found, and I won't spoil what that one was. So I'm like, oh, there is at least one letter that we get to hear. A letter that maybe wasn't expected to be found, but
yes, exactly.
But so you did get at least one letter in there.
I did get one letter in there, yes. It's kind of like at least allude to sort of what they were talking about without it being sort of, and you know, I really was careful about trying to keep him from dominating the story, even with her, you know, talking about falling in love with books and it really actually being her, you know, because he gave the book, but that he didn't give her the love. You know what I mean? Yeah. She found that herself. And really, honestly, that was with her starting off as not being a reader. That was the whole point of it. Like, sort of talking about me being a romance author. You know, when you read romance, it's because you want to experience that elation of falling in love again. Yeah. And so I actually really wanted Grace to not be a reader, because I wanted readers to travel through that journey in her eyes and see it through her heart, and really get to feel what it's like to fall in love with reading all over again. Because for so many of us, I know for me, it happened when I was very, very, very young. And so even just writing it, it was almost magical, kind of getting to experience it again through this character that I was making and the story that I was building. It was so much fun to get to do that.
So what book was the, I was just going to say, what book was the book that made you fall in love with reading when you were young?
So I really loved the Laura Ingalls Wilder series. She was the best. I read through the series like tons and tons of times. And when we were living in Germany one time, there wasn't room in housing, so we had to live off base. And Frau and Herr Hoffmann had this huge, beautiful garden. A lot of the gardens in Germany are really just stunning. And I used to run around barefoot. So my mom got me like a calico print dress and a bonnet. And like, seriously, I was Laura. Yeah, I mean, I ran around and I was like, we used to get so mad because they had this big metal basin that would get like rainwater, and they had these like straw plants that were growing next to it. And I would always soak the straw plants so I could like braid them and try to twist them into caps and everything. And they would tell my parents, please have her stop putting all this crap in the water. So, yeah.
Well, I hear you on that, because I know people say, well, what were the books that you first read? And I really don't remember, but I do remember The Librarian. I think I was in second grade, and I read the whole series in a week. And she was just like, how are you done every day? And I would come back, and even long winter, I'm like, next book, please.
Yes.
And she didn't know what to do with me. She's like, fine, take the next book and go away, child. But I mean, my first cat, the first pet I got to name was named Suki, which was the name of the cow from like, yes, I named you for a cow. I'm sorry, cat. There must be something magical about those books, or little girls who think they should wear their hair. And
bonnets.
Well, and you know, the thing that I loved about Laura so much, too, is that she wasn't a good little girl. And I wasn't a good little girl either. And she tried so hard. And I really tried hard. So I was like, girl, I get you. And I think that really helped connect, I think, so much for myself. And, you know, I see you nodding too. So definitely you too.
I was an Anne of Green Gables because I have red hair.
Red hair. I definitely.
Red hair, awkward. And so while you were Laura Ingalls Wilder running all around with your bonnets, I was pretending that I was Anne of Green Gables, reading Tennyson and reenacting the scene where she got, like, you know, almost drowned in a little boat and Gilbert found her.
I love it. I think that's fantastic. I mean, I'm just saying those are so wonderful foundational books as well.
They really are. And I think most of these books that I you know, when we talk to female authors and when we joke around, Allison and I, like the books that we connected with when we were kids, it's always about that little girl wasn't a very, you know, polite, nice little girl, but she was spunky and she, you know.
Oh yeah, definitely. Always getting into some kind of trouble, and no matter how much she tried not to, and
No, nobody wants to read about the boring little girl who follows all the rules. Those stories are not very fun. We need to have Ramona the
And our
Brave.
parents wouldn't let us read the ones that were nothing but rebels.
Need to have some history there. Well, and it was kind of funny. So last week we had a historical fiction author on, but she would be mad if she heard me saying this because she was writing from her own life perspective. And she was told that, okay, at this point now, the 60s are considered historical fiction. And your book is set just a little before that. So I was wondering, has anybody ever said, here's the line between historical fiction and contemporary fiction? Because I almost feel like the line is right after World War II. And I'm sure that's going to shift as we age. But obviously, I'm looking at you going, you and I are probably around close to the same age. We weren't alive during World War II. So it's not my experience. And the other author, Deborah K. Shepard, she was writing 60s and 80s, and that was her own life experience. And they're telling her, oh, that's historical fiction now. And she's like, okay, no, I'm going to put you over my knee and give you a young whippersnapper. But
that's crazy. But I would never have even thought that would be considered historical fiction. In fact, that makes, I wasn't born in the 60s, but I was born in the 80s. We'll just say that much. But I wouldn't even consider that historical, but it does make me feel a bit old even just thinking of that.
Well,
and if you think about sorry.
No, I was going to say it's our parents, and if we still have parents who are still alive, one of mine has passed, but one of my parents is still alive, and they lived through it. So the idea is if a person could write the story from their own perspective and they're still alive, is that historical? But then it's like, well, someone now could write a book about the 80s and call it historical fiction, and we're going, how dare you?
Right? No.
It's the
I don't agree with that at all for what it's worth.
Or like when they play 90s music and they call it oldies.
Right?
No. Nirvana is not oldies.
It's horrible and cruel. Yeah.
It's mean to us.
It is very mean to us. And we also have sensibilities.
Well, but then you would have possibly people reading your book who lived through these events, who are like, okay, they would have been very, very young at the time, but they would have been able to say, yes, I had my experience there. And even as you said at the beginning, the difference between being able to listen to something or look at a video of it versus not having any of that, obviously stuff when you're going back to the Regency era or medieval or Tudor times, obviously no one's alive.
Right. Hopefully not, because that would be creepy.
That would be creepy. That would be one of my books.
Yes.
I've actually had people who have told me that that they read my book and that they actually talked to their parents about it. Their parents still being alive, having lived through it. There was one woman who had reached out to me and she said her father was 97. And she was asking him, oh, did this really happen? And did this happen? And he was like, yeah, And
they were fact-checking you right there.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because I feel like it's been a really great sort of talking point for people who do know people who lived back then, because it's like, I didn't even know that this happened. And they're like, oh, it did. And then it kind of gets them to engage in stories that maybe they may not have been able to hear before. And those stories are so incredibly precious too,
Especially when it's told to you by a loved one or somebody that you personally know.
Absolutely.
So before we end tonight, are we allowed to ask what time period your next book is going to be in, or is this top secret?
Well, so my next historical fiction is going to be World War II as well. And it was announced in Publishers Marketplace a couple weeks ago, so I can talk at least a little bit about it. Yes. And but it's basically going to be two protagonists. One is going to be in France and one is going to be in Portugal. So yes. So I have my work cut out for me with research, because now instead of just researching one country, I am researching two countries, and none of them are English speaking. And say, but not that much.
And you're not even recycling anything that you used before. Well, we're still in London, so I still already did all this.
Nope, I'm completely starting from scratch. I'm a glutton for historical research punishment, but I don't mind.
Well, you can bring your passion into it. I love that you're doing that. Like if you love that and you love that era, what a better way to do it than get to research it, incorporate it, and bring your own characters to life in that time. That's awesome.
Thank you very much. I wish that I could go. Like, that's the hardest part, is the fact I was even looking, because it's due in November. And I was like, oh, maybe I could still get a chance to go. So I was kind of looking up the travel restrictions. And unfortunately, the places that I would need to go, that's just not, I don't think it's going to happen in time. So.
Well, Well, that's too bad because
Book
Portugal
tour
is
later.
amazing.
Definitely later. Yes.
Well, thank you, ladies. I hate to cut this short, but we are out of time. Madeline, thank you for being here. Congratulations again
Thank
on your New
you.
York Times bestselling novel, The Last Bookshop in London.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
ladies.
Allison, for being here. I just also want to thank everybody at the Global Authors on the Air Radio Network. Thank you to Pam Stack, our executive producer, Roman Saratin, our producer. This has been a copywritten podcast with the Global Authors on the Air Network. And next week, stay tuned, same time, Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, when we have Cynthia Paleo, the author of Children of Chicago. Sorry, I'm like reading because my COVID vaccine brain has made me a little fuzzy. So please join in next time. And thank you, everybody. And make sure to check out Last Bookshop in London.